It's not a one and done. It's here are our rules, and then please come back and let us know if you're getting stuck or something's not working. And so that's what we're doing in this next round. We're very pleased to have that leadership from our commission and that invitation to return with things that need to be modified or adjusted. And then the other piece to that in terms of our implementation is that we've been able to support our local partners with technical assistance and also with funding. They're making use of that and they're doing a great job. So I just wanted to let you all know that program is underway. We're quite pleased with it. And if this recommendation comes up for a vote after third reading, will be a no. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Bateman. Looks like we also have Deb. You got your hand up. Go ahead.
Dr. Bateman, in regards to the recommendation that came forward, I think that there was 4 cities that actually had some specific items that needed to be addressed. Are those going to be addressed in the November meeting, or you're saying that they will be addressed in the future?
Thank you for that question, Deb. There are a raft of adjustments that will be brought forward as part of the clarifications and corrections piece that our commission has invited us to bring. And then they have also extended an invitation for subsequent meetings if there are other issues that have not been addressed in this, or if there are broader issues that fell outside the scope of the corrections and clarifications, to feel free to bring those back as well. So it's definitely a work in process, but they remain and staff remains open to continued adjustments as needed. So many of their concerns will be addressed in this next round, and any that are not, we leave the door open for continued conversation and adjustment.
Thank you. Chair Hall, I don't know if it's possible or not, but perhaps there's a way that we can bring this recommendation back after the November meeting. So then we know that these items have been addressed, or that there's a process. Because I don't, if we're addressing them, I don't know that we have to continue. I mean, that will resolve some of the challenges that's here for those cities.
Acknowledge.
I guess that's on the table.
Yeah. No, I mean, we don't need to have recommendations that are duplicative of things that have already happened within the agency, for sure. So that's something that we can monitor. And, I don't really know the answer to that until after it sounded like there's a November meeting of LCDC, but we can, schedule the third reading of this recommendation for after that, so that folks can compare and contrast what is done versus what's in the recommendation. And as always, based on the public comment and input and testimony, the work groups can, amend or modify the recommendation as needed.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. JD, let's go right ahead, man.
Hey there. I was thinking maybe the Cozen Design could actually take the option of just withdrawing it between now and then, before the third reading, or even move the third reading to not the next meeting, but the following meeting. And then they can make a determination of whether or not they want to withdraw it. Another thing too is we can also adopt it and recommend it, and then have a quick check off as being completed when it's all done too.
Absolutely, much appreciated. I think that's all on the table, and I'd leave that to the work group process, and we can have as many conversations there or in this space in the future meetings as we want. All right, we got another hand up. Natalie, go right ahead.
I am open to delaying the third reading until after the November meeting. I think that, excuse me, I think that might be the simplest way to look at it. So I'm okay with doing that if the group is okay with that.
I'm seeing head nods and thumbs up. It is duly noted. We will track that in agenda preparation, and then just ask the Director Bateman if you could give that work group an update on what happens at the November meeting of the LCDC. that would be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe our commission meeting coincides with the next HPAC meeting, so I'll be absent and then I'll be back afterwards to let you know how the discussion went.
Fair enough. And just a small window into your busy schedule. All right. Anything further on the CFAC recommendation, either public testimony or comments from the commission, from the council, pardon me? All right. So I think we've got the finance recommendations that are on the second reading.
That's correct. So the next item up for public comment is the finance recommendation around ONA governance. There is nobody signed up in advance, so if you would like to testify, please raise your hand. Seeing no hands, we'll move to the next recommendation up for public comment, the SDC offset incentive. There's nobody signed up in advance. Please raise your hand if you'd like to testify. All right, seeing no hands, the next item up for public comment is the finance recommendation around the Middle Income Housing Fund. There's nobody signed up in advance. Please raise your hand if you'd like to testify. Okay, there's nobody raising their hand, so that would conclude public comment. Although I will mention, Co-Chair Hall, the mayor of Springfield wanted to provide some public comment, but is not able to join until 2:30. I will let you know when the mayor gets here, and so that we can offer the opportunity for public comment. But outside of that, public comment has been completed.
Fantastic. How about this? What if we take a 10-minute break since we're done with public comment? We're about an hour down. We got an hour and a half to go. We have 17 recommendations to hear from different work groups on. So hopefully we were able to power through the majority of those. Come back in 10 minutes. Hopefully the mayor of Springfield is on. We'll have their comment and then get into these first readings. Does that sound good? All right, my clock says 2:26. If we could all be back at 2:36, I'll see you then. Thanks, folks.
Mayor Van Gordon, we are on a short break until 2:35, and then we'll hear your comment. Thank you for being here.
It's 2:36. I'd like to welcome everybody back from the break. Hope you're able to stretch your legs. grab myself a caffeinated beverage, ready to tuck into that and go till 4 because we've got a good amount of business to get through. As I see some cameras coming back on, appreciate that. And I believe that we have the mayor of Springfield to provide some testimony, and then we'll get into the recommendations that we have from work groups for first reading. Matt, you want to call up the mayor and
Mayor Van Gordon, go ahead.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Sound great.
Suzanne?
Oh, outstanding. Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, my name is Sean Van Gordon. I'm the mayor of Springfield, and I really appreciate your flexibility allowing me to testify today. And I'm here on behalf of a coalition of cities to encourage your support for the CFECT recommendation under consideration. As noted in the letter we submitted today and previous comments to this council, the conflicts between CFECT and ONA threaten our ability to meet Oregon's housing production needs while advancing our values of mitigating climate change and expanding to access to housing and home ownership. We appreciate your attention to this topic because aligning the two initiatives is imperative. We also want to be clear that our support for aligning these two initiatives is because we support the goals of CFECT and are doing our part to help the acceleration of housing production that our communities desperately need. Our concern is that if the current process continues, these objectives will be delayed or impossible to achieve. As outlined in the letter, the risk is real. I won't spend time going through examples, but for Springfield, a 1,500 unit mixed density development is at risk because CFECT would most likely trigger a transportation system plan update, potentially adding years to the project development and potentially restricting transportation options necessary to support our communities best. Other cities, including Hillsborough, Happy Valley, Cornelius, Oregon City, Troutdale, Tualatin, Forest Grove, Medford, and many more, as represented by the League of Oregon Cities, face similar challenges, and some of those are outlined in the letter. Not all cities are the same. We face different challenges because of our infrastructure, our demographics, and our geography. However, we do share a commitment to mitigating the impacts of climate change and creating more equitable access to housing and home ownership. These values are already embedded in local planning for our communities, new residential and commercial developments. Yet without alignment between CFECT and ONA, these objectives become harder to meet, longer to meet, and frankly, more costly to meet. That is why we encourage you to adopt this recommendation. It does not need an executive order and should not require legislative action. We believe that DLCD has the existing authority to align this work, and doing so represents responsive government, creating a path for all of us to work together to deliver a more climate-friendly and equitable state where the path to home ownership is available and housing is affordable. Thank you for your time, your leadership, and your consideration for this recommendation. That is what I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Van Gordon. Much appreciated. And we'll take a look at that written testimony as well. All right. I believe that's it for public testimony. I see a hand. Natalie, go right ahead.
I had a question about the SDC offset recommendation, and I don't know how you'd like me to handle it. If you'd like me to just send something in writing to the finance work group, or if we could talk about it here. I hesitate to wait to third reading because then it's time to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have a lot to get through here to the extent it's intended to start or what we're looking for is a discussion. It's probably best to start it with the work group at the work group level and then bake it into the third reading and as a way that so that everyone's on the same page. I'm not sure we're going to get through 17 first readings in the next hour and 19 minutes.
Understand.
Yeah.
Send me and Ivory an email and we'll circulate it to the group and coordinate a response.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Natalie. All right. So let's hop into it with these first readings, starting with land availability, and I'm just going down the order that it's on in the agenda. We've got an expand brownfields redevelopment funding programs recommendation. And Deb, am I turning it over to you to present, or how are we doing this?
Alyssa Gertler is going to speak.
Alyssa, go right ahead.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
We're going to use our quick little PowerPoint just to summarize the SOA document. So our recommendation is basically expanding the capacity of Oregon Brownfields program with a focus on housing. There are two key pieces that we are recommending. Sorry, I have a new kitten and I had to chase it around. That's why I'm out of breath. The Oregon Brownfields program is actually quite successful and has had successful examples of housing development, but there are a couple of issues that were identified where the program could be improved or expanded to focus more on encouraging brownfields to be redeveloped for housing. One is focusing on allowing additional forgivability of what are now loans. The program does have the ability to forgive loans for a certain level of housing, but the idea would be to increase the forgivability to focus on housing all the way up to 120% AMI or below. We know that brownfields increase cost of projects, and so the idea would be to allow the loan to become a grant for housing. And with that, then what would need to happen is a recapitalization of the program. If you're forgiving loans, they don't revolve back and add to the program. So the idea would be to basically recapitalize the program along the lines of the 10-year housing production horizon. And then similarly, there would be an opportunity to modify the statute around the Brownfield Property Revitalization Fund to increase, to expand who is available for the forgivable loans. So right now it is limited to owners and operators, but the idea would be to expand it so that it would also be allowed for prospective purchasers, which would facilitate affordable housing development. The other thing we heard from the state agencies, Business Oregon, who runs the Brownfields program, and the Department of Environmental Quality, is that any increased demand would require increased capacity for them to support it at the staff level. So we are recommending the consideration of expanding staff capacity to meet the increased demand. The other thing we heard from subject matter experts is a theme that we've actually heard throughout this committee is the need to integrate multiple state agencies with different responsibilities to try to come together to accomplish something that really accomplishes more than one goal. So bring together not just Business Oregon and DEQ, but the Department of Housing, the Department of Land Conservation Development, and the Department of Health, all of whom have a role in making sure that we do affordable housing equitably on brownfields. Next slide. So the why this, why now question. Well, we know that brownfields are hard to develop, complicated. Many developers will not even take the risk just because of the unknown costs and uncertainty. That's even more acute when you're talking about affordable housing developers who are very cost sensitive. As I mentioned, the Brownfields program is successful and has successful examples, but they believe that they could do much more housing if they were able to do much more loan forgiveness and grant funding. So the other thing that we heard a lot is around sort of the idea of, is it a good idea to put housing on an environmentally contaminated site? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in general, there is a sense that taking unproductive, contaminated property in any community and facilitating its redevelopment for a healthy, productive use is an equitable thing to do, no matter the use. And of course, as we've talked about many times here, it's easier and faster to build land that is already served inside an urban growth boundary that has infrastructure than waiting years for infrastructure to be added to the land. Next slide. Oopsie. Okay, simple implementation. The legislature is responsible for passing legislation to modify the statute to both recapitalize the fund and to increase the loan forgivability threshold. That's the core of it. And then the agencies would implement those programs with a focus on outreach to affordable housing developers. Next slide. So again, brownfields add uncertainty, risk, and cost to any development. And so what we're trying to do is add to the suite of tools here that would facilitate land availability for housing, since that's the focus of our work group. One of the key points that is often brought up is that highly contaminated brownfield sites may take years of assessment and cleanup before they're ready for redevelopment. So not all sites are going to be easy and quick, but adding resources to try to accomplish multiple objectives can only be a good thing. In terms of the environmental justice implications of developing housing for vulnerable people on areas where contamination may have been, the state agencies, DEQ and Business Oregon, talk about that any property that is, any brownfield that is redeveloped for housing must meet the highest regulatory cleanup standards that are protective of human health and the environment, and may actually end up having a cleaner site than some of the property around it. The other key issue that's been brought up is the need to align funding for affordable housing. So through the programs that Oregon Housing and Community Services offers, funding programs where developments are often evaluated on a cost per unit metric, it is quite likely that brownfields properties would add to the cost per unit. So one, being able to provide additional subsidy upfront in the pre-development would help bring down those costs, and two, might be a conversation to have between state agencies about how to make sure that projects at the housing department are not being penalized, but are actually being rewarded for doing brownfield cleanup. And I believe that is the end of our slideshow. We did that one already. And there is an underground storage tank being removed. Any questions? Director
Questions?
Bateman, I don't know if you have anything else to add. We worked on this together.
Alyssa, no, I'm just really pleased with this recommendation, particularly as it doubles down on and supports a program that's already wworking, but is over, what's the word I'm looking for? Oversubscribed. Yeah.
15038214948.
All right, looks like we got a couple of hands. I first see Director Bell, then Erica, and then Natalie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Coach Hall. I appreciate you all bringing this in. This was a particularly interesting one to read, so I appreciate the thoughtfulness around it. Just a couple of considerations, none of which at this point need responses, but would love to be able to have a follow-up conversation in earnest on. Is one, I'd be curious to know what are the opportunities to expand some of the current provisions within pre-development in this environment in order to actually make this feasible. So not just plussing up pre-development, but also making sure that the sort of rules of engagement that currently exist around pre-development, where that would need to perhaps appropriately modify to be reflective of this particular strategy. That's thing one. Thing two, just really candidly, because I know this group, we're all having very open generative conversation, is I would be curious to know when we say would be more equitable to whom and by what metric. And I say that one, because I know that is one of the values collectively of the governor, as I've heard it, and also this body. So just thinking intently about because we are here centering humanity of the folks that we serve, and also recognizing that the humanity of those folks also emboldens us to be thinking, yes, around unit production and also the long-term sustainability and the health of those. And I think we've seen over time, well, not over time, right now, we're trying to untangle ourselves now of what happens when we don't center race and center those needs of folks in rural communities who happen to be some oftentimes lower income. And I think oftentimes, those realities, those co-occurring realities can also get lost in the shuffle. So curious to just know more about that. Again, not in the moment, just putting it out there. And then the third is because we are sort of getting now into the sort of the meat of a lot of considerations that aspire towards state agency alignment. I feel like I'd like to see us aspire towards something much more greater than alignment. I feel like alignment should be a very bare minimum of what we should be hoping for from our state agencies as an agency director. And so One thing that I would offer is rather than looking at more resources, aligning resources, making sure that the words say the same thing, I think we're going to have to kick the tire and look under the hood, particularly when you say the mention there of different state agencies coming together. I think that's right. I think with the specific intent of looking at all components, rules, statutes, policies, some of the sort of things that often get lost in the shuffle that often direct funding in certain ways. But if each of us as state agencies, even with all of the best intent, are saying that we have a program that aligns, I think over the years, so I think I have been really enlightened to see in certain communities where when we're not looking at the rules that are associated with some of those programs, they are counterintuitive at the local level, or they say 4 or 5 different things at the local level with all of the best intent. So I offer that and offer ourselves up to see where we can go beyond alignment to a greater level of integration across our resources, both in word and in action. So I appreciate this though.
Thank you, Director Bell. Much appreciated. I think it's like your hand went down, but Erica, did you have a hand up? Okay, then let's go quickly to Natalie.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really like this recommendation. I've had some experience working on site mitigation for contaminated soils, not for affordable housing, but for market rate housing. So I've seen how that can be successfully navigated and done. And so I think especially so I'm less fearful of that being an unintended consequence of having lower income housing sited on contaminated ground, because I've seen how that process can go. And I think especially since this recommendation has that in it as something to look for, that makes me feel even better that that won't end up being an unintended consequence. So I just wanted to say I really like this recommendation.
All right, thank you, Natalie. Daniel, right ahead.
Yeah, so I do brownfield work, not for residential, but mainly on the commercial side. So 2 things to point out. Number one, the standards that DEQ set are pretty stringent. So if it qualifies for residential use, it is safe, because it's all about how pathways from pollutants to people and what the receptors are. But something that I think would tweak this from a finance perspective, the recommendation talks about having DEQ, having staff to issue no further action letters. And those are great, but there's actually a program that DEQ has. You can get either a consent judgment or an administrative settlement. And what that does is basically stops third-party liability. So the state, on behalf of all potential claimants in an environmental action, can settle it and say, what you've done is good enough, and a court signs off on it. And now there is no liability. It's not just an NFA. It's a really good program, but it takes a while and it's a bit cumbersome. I think it would be helpful to include that here by saying, hey, DEQ, we're going to throw you some resources, and if it's brownfield for needed housing, we want you to prioritize or expedite using this consent judgment program. So just a thought, but I think this is a really good recommendation, especially in the context of the hand wringing we've had over, do we want to expand the UGB or look at lots that have trees on them? Well, this is land that we could develop that has services that's already in the city. So I support it.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Anything else on the brownfields recommendation?
I just wanted to say these are all fantastic comments, and I will be following up. We at the Land Availability Committee will want to take your feedback and try to incorporate it into the next version of the recommendation. So thank you all for what you said.
All right. Thank you, Alyssa, for the presentation, and the rest of the land availability group as well. All right, so moving on to land development permit applications, we've got 3 recommendations from that work group. We'll kick it over to Eric, and if you could lead us through, starting with the early feasibility acceptance recommendation.
Is Eric not here for everybody on this group?
I see him. He just came off mute.
Okay, I can't.
Not populating. Yeah. Great.
I had a moment of panic. I was like,
This recommendation is really a way to make a project more viable, at least in terms of determining feasibility early in the project. Very often, as developers will go into a potential, bare site that sits there, and we know early in the process there are going to be certain things that we're not going to be able to satisfy in terms of standard development, things that are not explicitly allowed in the design process. And to be able to get early action on those items would, I think, do two things. First, it would allow a developer to decide whether the project is feasible or not, and to be able to get those exceptions determined upfront rather than waiting, which we typically have to do, waiting for 3 years for the entire project to be application to be complete, so that you get a determination whether the project can move forward or not. So this is really it helps on that front. Having worked with Sean Edging, he reviewed this, and he thought from the city side it's very helpful too, because lots of resources could be saved on the city side if indeed certain exceptions are not going to be allowed. This would allow cities to sort of not have to spend the time to review projects in the long haul. So it's kind of a win-win situation, and that's kind of the basic idea. Know early whether you're going to be able to proceed with the project or not, and that would really give, I think, a lot more likelihood that some projects would indeed move forward, because the risk of having to wait 3 years, 5 years, 4 years would really go down, because you would know that the key items that are going to need to be accepted within the project. So that's the basic idea of it. I assume you've read it. If you got any questions, happy to answer those.
All right, thank you, Eric. Much appreciated. See a hand up, Director Bell. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Full of questions today. Thank you for this, Eric. I appreciate it. One curiosity I have is this particular, at least from your own seat and your own expertise of sort of the aches and pains that you are on the receiving end, I'm curious about speed of delivery on the permitting side, and then the contents of the permitting on the permitting side. So like oftentimes what we see is that we hear feedback, and again, this is from my seat, not from yours, where we hear around sort of the clunkiness or the slowness around permitting. And then sometimes we see that get accelerated, and then the contents of the permitting is insufficient or creates its own sort of cost escalations or other types of things. So I'm curious just your thinking and approach or desired outcomes on this from your own seat. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the big piece is that early on, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to spend as much time and money working on an application. You wouldn't need to do full engineering design. You wouldn't necessarily need to do a complete architectural design. It really sort of frees you up from a fair amount of work up front, because you know clearly what, for instance, you're going to know if a street grade is going to exceed if the city has a 12% maximum street grade, you're going to know for sure whether your development is going to require an exception in something like that. But to really wait until the very end of the process, until you get an approval, and even after the application's been approved, you still have to deal with public works, and you may get, it may not actually work ultimately in the final design. So that really gets answers up front, and saves money and time, because you don't have to have a complete application package.
All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add a little bit. For a lot of the design professionals, when we're working on a development, right now the pre-application really is very, very broad, and really it's helpful, but not to the extent that this recommendation would make, right? So, for example, once you kind of then move into type 1 review or type 2 review to then close out the entitlement process, it becomes a little too late when you then suddenly discover certain things may or may not be allowed. And that has happened. I've experienced that, and then having to kind of rejigger a lot of the design work and everything, that just adds more time in the process. Because there has to be a back and forth that the new addition that has been done. So what this really allows is the pre-app really provides a little bit more specificity in the recommendations on a particular development. So when we do go then to type 1 review or type 2 review, we know that the predictability of its approval is a lot higher. And so this just really adds that and makes that much more efficient.
All right, thank you. Further comments, questions? All right, well, I think then we are going to move on to the next recommendation for the Land Development and Permit Applications Work Group. Eric, I think we may be back to you for appeals expedited process and then appeals LUBA electronic filing.
Eric, you're on mute, but did you want me to take these two?
Hey, Daniel,
Yeah,
you ready to take those on?
I got it. Let me screen share.
All right.
Okay, so we have two recommendations here for LUBA. Let me know if you can't see the first one. So this is about creating an expedited process for appeals of certain housing decisions. We tried to keep this narrowly constrained. LUBA is a relatively fast process and reasonably efficient. But when you look at the data for LUBA, you say, well, there's not a lot of housing stuff that gets appealed up. But from the development community, we know that there is a chilling effect that comes from the threat of an appeal. So a lot of times people will compromise or do things on the front end that aren't necessarily the most efficient way to run a project, but so that they can stay out of the appeals process. So this recommendation creates a new type of land use appeal or land use decision called an urban housing decision. And that's to clean up some piecemeal work that's been done before with limited land use decisions, expedited land use decisions, and to add in a couple new things. So the proposed action will be limited to land use things that are within an urban growth boundary, on land that's zoned for residential, and is primarily related to the approval of residential development. So plat approvals, design reviews, conditional use permits, anything that's primarily related to residential. And if it falls within those buckets and it gets appealed, there's a expedited, limited process in front of LUBA. And the key elements of that are no interventions other than the appellant. So the parties to it are whoever's appealing it, the city, or whoever's doing the approval, and the developer. And if there's multiple appeals related to a project, they can be administratively consolidated. Briefs are limited to 250 words per assignment of error. So just for context, the text that you see on the screen is about 250 words. If you think something is fundamentally wrong with a project, that you've had your constitutional rights violated, or there's been a glaring miscarriage of justice, you should be able to summarize it in 250 words. It's important to remember that LUBA is a creature of Goal 1. It is not a court. It's an executive branch entity that's supposed to be accessible to citizens. So you don't have formalities like you do if you go in front of a court system. You don't have to be an attorney. You can just be a person, and they allow you a lot of latitude to show up and state your case. That's a big strength for LUBA, but on the flip side is it needs to be quick and efficient. So we've kind of fallen into a worst of both worlds where, well, you need 38 pages of pleadings as if you're in circuit court. Oh, but by the way, you don't have to be an attorney. So this clears it up and takes it back to its Goal 1 roots. We're requiring that the record be transmitted within 7 days of the notice of intent to appeal. Speaking with LUBA board members themselves, that is one of the biggest delay problems, is getting the record to LUBA. All the timelines are keyed off of the city or whoever did the decision getting their paperwork up to LUBA and to the parties. If it's a straightforward decision like this, that should be ready to go within 7 days. For the filings, because it's only 250 words, we're saying 7 days to file your appeal, 7 days for the reply brief. Oral arguments can be at the discretion of LUBA, not entitled. If they are, they're to be held within 15 days and a decision 21 days thereafter. That puts us in like 56 days, I think, total on the process. Right now, LUBA's running 100 plus. The standard for review is going to be an obvious error, which is substantially prejudicial to the appellant. That's an area where Damien might want to weigh in a little bit as a member of the bar, saying, how does that differ from current analysis? What we're really trying to get at here is, as opposed to LUBA going down a rabbit hole talking about technicalities, if it's needed housing and it's in a city, in a UGB, and it's residential, to stop it, there really should be something obviously wrong with it, not some obscure argument between dueling experts. This is all to say, if you are the applicant and you're appealing against the denial, you can still choose to go through the regular LUBA process. So you're not being deprived of any rights. If you really want to do the full set of appeals, good for you. We have a requirement in here that remands be administratively resolved. So anything getting remanded should have a clear direction for how to fix it, and there should be an administrative process at the city to address that. That will require some code updating, but will make the process more efficient. And we're saying that if you appeal past LUBA and it's within these conditions, that there begins to be a requirement that there's some damages tied to the amount of housing. We picked $1,000 per dwelling unit because there needs to be some proportionality. If you're appealing 180U, okay, that's $1,000. If you're appealing a 300 unit subdivision and holding it up with an appeal that's not being sustained, there needs to be some bite to that at some point. And just to put everybody at ease, we're talking about projects that are in a UGB on land that's zoned residential and have been approved by the local government. And once you jump through those, the balancing here with the emergency, I think warrants having these tighter requirements. So having said that, I'll pause and ask for questions, and I will give credit to Damien. The genesis of this was a list of bullet points he scribbled down, and we fashioned it into what we think is a pretty decent recommendation.
Thank you, Daniel. Questions, comments? Natalie, go ahead.
So, like comp plan zone changes would not qualify for this.
No, unfortunately not. The comp plan is a legislative action, and so that's a whole nother animal. Zone changes we did not put in here because I think that's gonna be a quagmire if you try to say this happens to zone changes. I'd be okay with it, but that's because I'm biased. I was a city councilor, and I think, hey, if your council votes to do a zone change, you should probably do it. That's how representative democracy works. But we kept this one narrowly constrained, narrowly focused.
Yeah, I'm not advocating to include it. I was just more clarifying.
Yeah, zone changes are not here.
Much appreciated. Any further questions or comments? I just take a moment to say this is kind of like the natural and logical progression of the clear and objective standards for needed housing, because the idea behind that is everyone knows what the standards are, and they are readily applied, and then it it either is or is not approvable. But some of that is undermined by folks who can take these things to LUBA and then pen 14,000 words on whether or not something is clear and objective, hold up your project for a number of years while you argue over if something's clear and objective, and ultimately it should have been approved all along. And that's not the typical situation, but I think it is something that has happened around the state, and there are a number of examples, and this should be consistent with the direction that the housing policy is going, that we can do a limited and streamlined review. JD, I see your hand up. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I definitely support this this recommendation, but my question is more kind of anticipating questions is what is the scope of the problem? How often does this actually occur? Do you have any sense of that?
It's difficult to assess. So I went back and I looked at all the LUBA cases for last year, which was just a blast. And how often they were overturned, how many related to housing. There's not as many related to housing as you would suspect. And LUBA's got a pretty good batting average on Court of Appeals review. But the problem is you have this threat of the appeals process hanging over you, that someone's saying, well, I'm going to take you to LUBA in the Court of Appeals unless you do this. And there's no way to quantify that. So you're right. It's kind of difficult to say what's the magnitude of this, but given the housing emergency, I think these are all reasonable things and it should move it in the right direction. Having said that, I'll let anybody else who's got experience with this chime in, but that's I talked to a lot of people, and that's the sense that I came away with. So
Yeah, I mean, I regularly advise clients on sort of what is the cost benefit analysis of modifying a project in a way that creates less units versus in order to satisfy a potential opponent, things like that. And then the worst case scenario is just got somebody savvy, they can you can get approval at the local level, you can get approval by LUBA, like they read the law correctly and that everyone understands it. You still have an appeal by right to the Court of Appeals, and then you're basically out 1.5 years from your first approval. If you have opponents that simply just show up and are pro se litigants and just do their thing. So I mean, I think if the idea is we have clear and objective standards and that it's readily apparent how they're applicable, we should have a more efficient timeline for applying those standards as well. And so that if there are local governments that are bad actors and they clearly overlook standards, we can catch that at the standard of review that we're proposing here. But the idea is that it gets identified and it gets fixed in a short amount of time so that we don't slow down housing production.
okay, I'm going to do the companion one also. So this doesn't directly relate to housing production, but in the course of looking at land use, it feels like such low-hanging fruit and so obvious that I kind of advocated for it to be here. LUBA is all done by first-class mail, which is kind of ridiculous. You can't email, you can't fax. You print things with different colors of paper and you put it together and you mail it to everybody. It's 2023, we can do better. There's a couple of good arguments for that. Number one, it will go faster because when you have all those times, then there's mailing in there. And sometimes the post office isn't great. Sometimes the mail goes slower than you think it does. This is also something that LUBA has asked for in several budget cycles, and it really doesn't cost that much and will make all land use processes go better and be more transparent for the public, which feeds right back into goal 1, which I'm a big proponent of. So there's a couple different flavors of this, but option 1, LUBA needs an electronic filing system. That's the simple way to say it. You can attack it a couple different ways. We have a statewide electronic appeals management system in place in all 36 counties. It's the appellate case management system, but it's run by the judicial branch. And so there's some interesting separation of powers issues there. So a good argument for it is, hey, you could bolt it on. It's relatively easy. A bad argument is it's built for lawyers. It's a little technical. And now we've got an executive branch agency operating under the judicial branch's system, which the judicial branch probably would not like. So we've also got option B, which is to create a new electronic filing system. And that could be either a standalone filing system for LUBA, or we could really swing for the fences and say there's a statewide land use filing system that every jurisdiction uses. And while I generally don't like, here's big state mandates, you all have to shoehorn into this. Repeatedly, one of the biggest impediments is getting the record transmitted up to LUBA. And if there was a statewide system, that record would be available for everyone instantaneously 24/7. So there's no reason that land use decisions need to happen in secret. There should just be one state website you can go to and learn about any land use application that's in process or has been adjudicated. Now, the state doesn't have a great track record rolling out IT projects. I think that's a relatively uncontroversial statement. So this would take money and time and planning. You'd also have to decide where that should be housed and the support that would be given to the local jurisdictions. But it really would bring our land use system into the 21st century and allow for meaningful participation. Just on a personal note, I think we're still stuck in the 1970s mindset for SB 100. A lot of jurisdictions say, well, you can put a sign on the property and post a notice in a newspaper of general circulation. That is so far away from how most of society wants to interact with government that I think we are really failing on public involvement. And this would lay the groundwork and be a backbone for meaningful, easy, low barrier public involvement. So I think there's a whole host of other good benefits that come along with this, but keeping our focus on housing production, anything we can do to make the appeals process quicker, more transparent, I think is moving us in the right direction. So happy to answer questions on this one as well.
Right on. Thank you, Daniel. And JD, I'm not sure if your hand's up from earlier, if you had another question. I think it may have been from earlier. Any questions, comments on that recommendation for e-filing? Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Land Development and Permit Applications Work Group. As with all of these first readings, those will be coming back to us for public testimony and then additional work and then a third reading. All right, turn it over to the Code and Design Work Group and Natalie. We've got a number of recommendations. And is this the single stair recommendation? If not, just let's run with what we got on the screen. Looks like single stair. Yeah, we're good.
Hi.
Oh, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, Co-Chair Hall, sorry to jump in here. I think I'm going to give Natalie a little bit of a reprieve here, and I'm sorry that, especially for the members of the public that are here, I'm sorry we don't have a more concise PowerPoint. But I'm just going to try to summarize briefly this recommendation. This is to allow the use of a single stair in a low-rise configuration in buildings beyond 3 stories. So currently a single stair is only allowed to buildings that include 3 stories plus a basement below grade. So technically 4 levels, but only 3 stories above grade. So this recommendation allows the use of a single stair with certain standards and certain implementation requirements above that 3-story current configuration. And why this is important is because 3-story, especially multifamily apartments, are the primary building typology for affordable, accessible housing at a reasonable density. So we feel like this recommendation can be very impactful in kind of accelerating supply in that kind of medium density configuration that's widely used for kind of middle income and affordable housing development. So related work plan topics, accessibility, increasing housing affordability. The State Building Codes Division has already been exploring a similar recommendation, so it's very much in line with what is on their docket. And so we've heard a lot from BCD in the preparation of this recommendation. Other jurisdictions like Seattle have adopted similar recommendations. And so we looked at those in order to inform this one for your consideration today. If you so there's a little bit of data here in terms of qualifying and quantifying the impact and how this how the current landscape is impeding the development of buildings like this, including how many units, additional units would likely be incented by the recommendation. One issue came up when we were considering this at the work group, and that is BOLI wage rates are triggered when you go above, when you raise the height to 5 stories or more. So we asked to include a provision that these types of buildings be exempted from the BOLI wage requirements up to 5 levels. That's an important note to keep in mind. We had great subject matter expert testimony from, as I mentioned earlier, from some of the staff and leadership at BCD. Also, there's been a lot of work by some nonprofit organizations across the country and important input from the Deputy State Fire Marshal as well, because, you know, obviously nothing we're doing here should adversely impact our first responders from being able to safely get people out of buildings in the case of an emergency. Short time frame, high feasibility, low cost. All of this is pretty self-explanatory. As I mentioned, this code change was already under review and was actually directed by the governor, so no further legislative action is required. Could be implemented administratively by BCD. Here are some of the provisions, so, and these are occurring in other jurisdictions as well. No more than 4 units could be accessing that single stair per floor, and also exiting distance requirements are very important. So the farthest part of habitation could be from that exit stair is 125 feet, and the requirement of operable windows. Made a note here that it's possible to upgrade sprinkler systems as well in order to enhance the fire protection in the building. With that, I'll conclude and open it up to any comments.
All right, comments, questions from the group? Seeing a hand, Gary, go right ahead, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly touch a little further on the BOLI wage trigger. So I serve on the board for Rose Community Development Corporation. It's a nonprofit focusing on purely community building and affordable housing, similarly working with farm worker housing development. And for a lot of these nonprofits, being able to do these types of garden style apartments is very critical, because, you know, taking out the corridors and being able to serve units with 1 stair makes it much more economical. However, you know, currently on any affordable housing, you know, that gets any kind of a LIHTC funding or any sort of a state funding, you cannot build over 4 stories without triggering the BOLI wage, which adds a substantial amount of, you know, cost to the development. And what it's, we've been talking about building up to really densify rather than building out, right? And so in order to be able to do that, you know, we really need to put a sort of a, you know, exemption on the BOLI wage trigger, I would say even up to 6 stories, to really free up, to really influence the unit production and all of that. Otherwise, you know, this particular single stair recommendation will not be, you know, like the nonprofit will not be able to utilize the benefit of this, because, you know, as soon as you build above 4 stories, you're triggering BOLI wages and all of that. So that's why we wanted to kind of put this together. And I know Tom said that, you know, the BOLI wage trigger would be for this type of building, but I would even say, like, for affordable housing, any type of building, you know, to do the BOLI wage exemption for up to 5 or even 6 stories. And that's why we have added that as along with this recommendation. With that, I'll stop.
All right, thank you. Margaret, go right ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this recommendation. As somebody who has a few scars from earlier in my career working on wage determinations for affordable housing with various labor commissioners that our state has had, I just want to note that it's its own very important and politically fraught set of policy questions. And while I'm in favor of moderating the bully wage determinations for affordable housing, I feel like these need to be in two recommendations. I think the constituencies are going to be really different, and I think the policy, the stairwell thing probably is administrative within the executive branch, but the labor commissioner is a separate statewide elected official and with its own sort of system of policy governance and so forth. So I'm in favor of it, but recommend that you break it apart.
All right, thank you.
Will do.
Thank you.
Any further questions, comments, discussion on this recommendation? If not, let's keep it moving and get to the density swap recommendation. Who's up for that one?
That'll be me.
All right, Natalie. Go ahead.
Okay. This recommendation is for land where it is encumbered by something that makes it not developable. So landslide hazard, floodplain, wetlands, topography, trees, etc. If that portion of your property is more than 15%, that you're allowed to take the density from that piece and move it over to the other piece. And then lot dimensional requirements are not applicable to that portion of the piece. Essentially, it allows you to do a PUD, but not in a PUD process, in a clear and objective process. I think there's quite a bit of land, especially once the FEMA BIOP opinion comes through, that we'll have quite a bit of land that will no longer be developable. And I think this could really help allow us to still maintain the density that land is supposed to have in the buildable land inventory, but just do it in a different way. Some cities already allow for this. Some cities, you have to ask permission to do this. I think if the applicant would like to do that, it should be more of an outright allowance. For the jurisdictions that do allow it, they don't tend to have the site dimensional requirements. They focus more just on the density, and that allows a little bit more flexibility for the type of housing that can be put in. That's essentially the nuts and bolts of this recommendation. There wasn't necessarily agreement from cities that they liked it. City of Albany allows it, and so they were okay with it. City of Wilsonville didn't think it was applicable. City of Salem allows you to do a townhouse process, or you could do a PUD. So that's kind of the SME feedback we got. I believe this could be done immediately. Could be like a DLCD implementation. I think the feasibility is high and it's not really a high cost. So with that, happy to take any questions on the density swap recommendation. Hopefully no one's getting sick watching that.
Thank you, Natalie. See, Alyssa, you got your hand up?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. I just wanted to say, I think this one would be really useful for the jurisdictions that I represent in Clatsop County along the coast, and in where the landslide zone meets the wetland zone, if you look at the map. And this is something that actually a number of our cities have been looking at and have asked to bring forward. And so I think this will be something, to your point, that it may not work everywhere, but this is something that will really make a big difference in Clatsop County. So you'll have my support.
Fantastic. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on this recommendation? Okay, well, let's keep it moving. Up next, we have the middle housing recommendation.
All right, I had that one geared up. This one just kind of looks at some ways to modify the existing middle housing code to make it more flexible for cities to implement. We heard about the need for this from the city of Bend and Portland. A lot of the things that are in this recommendation are things that the city of Bend is already looking, they're in the process of implementing these. And so this would just be kind of rolling out the legwork that the city of Bend has already done. So it would remove the state code provision that requires a single service for each lot. The water meters is a little bit more complicated, but you could have a manifold, you could have a single line come off the line and then put the meters behind the line. So this would allow for that. Also would allow for shared sewer laterals. When we, I don't know if anyone remembers, but when we were talking about the cottage cluster recommendation, there was concern from Rep. Dexter about the maintenance and how that would work for that. So we kind of stepped back and figured out how could the maintenance be done. If you have two, say you have a duplex, they share a sewer line and the sewer line needs maintenance work. One party pays, the other party doesn't. How do you do that? Currently, we asked some cities, well, what would you do now if you had that situation? And they'd say, well, we'd condemn the house and kick everybody out. But there are measures that cities already have, like for stormwater systems. If a private developer is not maintaining their stormwater systems, cities will go on and perform the maintenance and then bill the private developer, and so, or the property owner. So I believe something like that could be done here to allow for the maintenance to occur, and you could have the paying owner would pay, and then the city could, bill the other side that wouldn't pay for their share. This would also allow for middle housing land divisions to be done prior to building permit issuance. So I think we could see more middle housing being done if developers were able to do the middle housing land divisions more upfront. So that's this recommendation. Happy to take any questions.
Questions? Okay, seeing none. Feel free to pipe in if I'm missing a hand. Let's move on to the next recommendation, visitability and accessibility recommendations.
So part of, in the framework for codes and design, there's a policy that we are supposed to be doing things to increase accessible units and increase visibility. So we had some accessibility advocates come to our work group and kind of discuss the things that they see that are needed for this. So this recommendation, one of the things it does is it has a very loose recommendation of what visitability is, because that can be kind of confusing. People can mean different things when they talk about visibility, but this would provide an incentive for single family and middle housing developers to make their units visitable. So that could be a one-time tax benefit or credit to the homeowner, things like reductions in setbacks and increases in lot coverage or FAR allowance. And this is partially because one of the things that came up in the work group was the requirement to have an maneuverable bathroom for a wheelchair can take up quite a bit of space. And so in order to have that space in a smaller, say, middle housing unit, sometimes you're taking space out of the other living spaces. So if if home builders had the chance to have a reduction in their setbacks, that could give them the space and maybe they would be more likely to build a visitable unit. They also, the accessibility advocates said they would like an increase in the type A units that are required in multifamily projects. They wanted 7.5%. The work group settled on 5%. We felt like that was a number that was doable and didn't place too much extra burden on multifamily sites. We also wanted there to be a way to connect people who had accessible units and people who were looking for accessible units. And so this recommendation says that as a part of the ONA reporting, cities can report the number of accessible units that they have, and that could be both multifamily and single family homes. And the state to work to have a database so that you could connect people looking for an accessible unit with landlords that have it. That way landlords wouldn't be renting to the next person on the waiting list. They could actually put people in the units that need the units. And the last part was the accessible advocates said things like grab bars are helpful even in a non-maneuverable bathroom, right? They can be helpful for people who are not just in wheelchairs. And so this recommends amending the building code to require backing be installed on all first floor bathrooms. And if you look at the public testimony that we got from Kathy Wild, she was one of the advocates that participated. She specifically called out that she would like to see that for all single family, and it is in here for all single family. So with that, happy to take any questions.
All right. Not hearing any questions, Natalie. Thank you for the thorough presentation. And thanks for all the work on that. It's timely. We had some testimony on that earlier in the day as far as accessibility, and you know, maybe there's some overlap between some of the folks that talked to the work group and that came and spoke to the full group today, and good to see the engagement. Last recommendation from Codes and Design is about franchise utility timelines. Is that you as well, Natalie?
I'm going to let Eric talk about this one.
All right, Eric, go right ahead.
All right, sounds good. Still having problems sharing my screen, so great. So it's pretty simple, simple problem. You know, typical developments require to get the franchise utility design incorporated. Typically some cities review and require them before you submit your final design. Some cities do not. The primary idea behind this is that we have a time frame, which in a typical joint trench application where you know, power goes in, gas, communications. The idea is that we provide a clear time requirement deadline for those designs to be submitted to the applicant. We don't know for sure. There's some ambivalence out there whether it's actually a requirement right now. We've got a request out to PUC to find out if indeed there are required timelines that aren't being adhered to currently or not. So we are waiting for feedback on that. But this basically essentially requires a electrical design to be completed within 60 days of submittal, and the other following items that go in the joint trench, natural gas, communications, those would be required to be within 45 days after the primary power layout is done, which is kind of the driver of that entire design. So that's the basic idea behind this recommendation.
All right, thank you, Eric. Questions, comments to the group?
Any questions?
All right, seeing none. You know, thank you very much to the Codes and Design group. Great work. Glad you're taking the time to move these recommendations forward. And I think we've got 20 minutes for the finance group. We'll see how far we can get into this, and just start at the top of the risk insurance and risk pool. Am I turning it over to Ivy or Daniel?
Yeah, I'll take this one and I'll let Daniel take the rest of them. So this recommendation provides resources to support the long-term needs of property and liability insurance for affordable housing. So I'm going to share a little bit about the significant rises in insurance premiums and how they're making the affordable housing development and preservation unaffordable. As we all know, the state of Oregon has made a commitment to provide high needs housing and increase the inventory supply of affordable housing for Oregonians. However, rising insurance rates are crushing the economic feasibility of developing affordable housing. Many of our affordable housing developers, owners, and operators are experiencing unprecedented challenges in financing and operating affordable rental housing due to skyrocketing cost increases of casualty, general liability, and builder's risk insurance. And if not addressed soon, insurance premiums, premium inflation will cause irreparable harm to our existing affordable housing communities and prevent the ability of developers to finance desperately needed new affordable housing supply. In 2022, early 2022, the Oregon Housing and Community Services, with input from selected public housing authorities and staff from the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services, conducted an insurance premium survey of its partners, asking housing providers about recent changes to the cost of their insurance. And in that study, about 49% of the respondents reported that their insurance premiums have increased 51% or more in 2019 to 2022, with 26% reporting increases of 100% or more. So these escalating premiums are significant contributors to rent inflation and broadly, affect rental housing affordability across our state. Affordable housing operators are particularly vulnerable, as I stated, to insurance inflation because I say we because I'm also an affordable housing provider, cannot pass the premium increases to our residents. And so meaning that when affordable housing operators, most of us are statutorily prohibited in the ability to increase rent to offset the cost of increased insurance or any other operational cost increases. So the consequences of any inaction could be dire. If the insurance market is not stabilized, affordable housing production will decline dramatically at a time when our state desperately needs to add to its inventory. So we in closing, I just want to say thank you so much to our subject matter experts. We've had lots of conversations with the housing authorities of Oregon, conversations with the insurance commissioner and his staff, and other subject matter experts to include Jeff Hawk. And then we've had received quite a bit of data from the Oregon Insurance Guarantee Association, as well as Synchronous. And we realize that our state do have access or have some insurance accesses, but some models out there to consider. And so we want to make sure that we bring forth this recommendation in hopes that our group will approve it to go on to the public comment.
All right. Thank you, Ivory. Any follow-on questions, comments on the insurance risk pool recommendation? Okay. Oh, I see. Director Bell.
Yes, thank you, Co-Chair. I will make it quick. Just want to acknowledge appreciation for this particular consideration, and this is one very much that I and we at OHCS embrace. This is something that we've heard rising over the last few years. I think some of you may be aware that some of what Councilor Matthews referenced also helped to drive, really candidly, some honest feedback from folks that helped to drive a PSH risk mitigation pool. But I think what we are just seeing and acknowledging is our state has to be able to effectively chew bubblegum and walk at the same time. So in addition to increasing more units, looking at sustainability of those units, preservation, it is also about making sure, particularly but not exclusively over the last couple of years, where the state can help shoulder financially and otherwise some of the burden that will otherwise be on owner operators at a local level. And so just acknowledge appreciation for this. And this is one that we very much embrace.
All right, thank you, Director Bell. Anything further on that recommendation before we hop to local infrastructure funding surge?
All right. Ivory and Karen work their tails off on the insurance one. That's a huge topic, and they deserve lots of kudos for that. So let's talk about, we've had several months of really good ideas. Unfortunately, a lot of the really effective ones are going to take money. So this is where we got to start talking about, okay, what's the other side of this look like? One of the things that we know that we have to tackle is more capacity at the local level to just support residential housing in general. A lot of the solutions that the state's adopted in the last few years just set expectations for local jurisdictions. When you look at things like, the climate-friendly equitable communities, we just have goal 10 that we have that says you have to have housing. We say local jurisdictions, you have to go out and do this. But as you'll recall from the very first document we got, which was the SDC study by OHCS, their revenue has been declining for 50 years. And we're seeing that effect everywhere. There's not enough infrastructure to support housing, and that leads jurisdictions to be in the position of looking like they're against having more housing when most of them aren't. So we know that there's going to need to be significant funding. One of the things that I think is really important to keep in our mind as we talk about getting funding to local jurisdictions, we have standards that require public improvement. Roads have to be a certain way. You have to have a certain amount of stormwater. You have to have your sewer system do certain things. These are public standards for public facilities, and the public pays for them. We're paying for them all right now, but we pay for them in a very, very strange way by having huge SDCs or fees or developer improvements. That means all of us citizens are paying for these things through higher rent. We're paying them through higher utility fees where things get tacked on so local governments can balance their budgets. We're paying through increased medical bills to cover the cost of an ER that's treating people who can't get into stable housing. So these costs are very real and they do exist. We're just not seeing them. So this recommendation is about saying the state needs to step up and make funding available for critical infrastructure to local jurisdictions so they can go out and do their jobs. We had a good state infrastructure package, I think, in 2016. So this is kind of a component, but funneling that down to the local level. Now, we are not budget writers. We are not revenue experts. This is not an exhaustive list of things that we can do. This is really to start the conversation to say, hey, there needs to be a serious look at raising revenue on a statewide basis and making it available for jurisdictions so they can build the things that they need to build. We have uniformly heard this from every city that's come talk to us and said, we don't have the resources to support the housing that needs to happen. So this is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to a housing emergency and how do we house people, because either we have to fund this stuff properly or we have to lower our expectations, and lowering our expectations will either be housing's not affordable or we've got to reduce the level of service that we expect to provide when it comes to these are the public improvements that we expect to support housing. So lots of detail in the written memorandum. Happy to answer questions here or let other members of the community speak up. Again, this is absolutely in the wheelhouse of the legislature, and would expect that any revenue package would be debated to death. But it's just here to draw attention to it and start the conversation. Going once, going twice. See a hand. Natalie.
Question about the payroll tax, because this is an issue. City of Salem is on the ballot. So there's discussion about a payroll tax. The percentage that they're proposing is higher than 0.5%. My question is, would this recommendation, if the state were to implement a statewide payroll tax, would that preclude cities from also having an additional payroll tax on top of it?
My understanding is no, I don't think there's a preemption against cities. That's what allowed Salem to adopt their payroll tax. So no, the state has the authority to adjust payroll taxes, is my understanding. It's similar to there was a 0.1% payroll tax a few years ago to support transit. So it's the same concept, except for this would be limited to streets, stormwater, sewer, things like that.
Follow up if I may. If we're so part of the rationale behind the Salem's payroll tax is because property taxes are not high enough, and that's partially why they need the extra income. This has provisions to increase property taxes. Is there any reason why you couldn't put in here that it would limit a city's ability to put in an additional payroll tax?
Absolutely, the legislature could do a preemption. Well, you get into some interesting stuff about city charters and home rule authority, but on a general basis, the state can preempt cities from doing certain things. That's a political compromise that would need to be made and is way beyond our ability to talk about. But yes, I would suspect that any solution here would require making some trade-offs about what cities couldn't do. Say, we're going to give you revenue, but you can't just go blow it all on salaries. So we're going to limit you in some other areas.
Alyssa, go right ahead.
Yeah, you guys may remember that the land availability work group, we also brought a recommendation on infrastructure funding. And I kind of like how these fit together because we really spoke to infrastructure uses around making land available, but we didn't speak to how to fund it. And you guys kind of, so this, I think these go well. This is like how sources and uses mixed together. You're a little bit more general in the uses, and we were very more specific. And so thank you for taking on the hard part of figuring out where the money could come from. And I just wanted to sort of bring these two together because I think they can fit well together. And it's why you have two different work groups, one to look at land and one to look at financing. So
thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's also important to remember we styled this as a surge. So this would be for the 10 years of the emergency. Now, we all have opinions on once you implement a tax, what are the odds of it sunsetting? But that's probably for another conversation. But this is really saying we are going to surge money to local jurisdictions to accomplish all the things that we've told them they have to do. So, Director Bell, who's
Yep. Yeah, thank you for that, Councilor Bunn. Councilor Van Vliet, I think I saw your hand up before. Did I cut you off?
I changed my mind.
You changed your mind.
No,
Yeah.
you did not.
you now support tax increases. Great. We'll put you down for that.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure Matt is looking at the time here and looking to wrap us up. And so I will be judicious with my words here. So I really appreciate this. I like this. I want to know more about it. So a couple things. So in my initial review, Daniel, I was thinking about OAHTC. So I was thinking about the Affordable Housing Tax Credit, which just for visibility. So it's just a state income tax credit, produces lower rents for renters with lower incomes, and essentially allows banks to reduce the interest for affordable housing by 4%. And so I'm curious to know more about sort of the delineation of that. But I think now that I hear a surge of that helps give me a better picture. So that's thing one. Second, I will just say I will be a broken record here. I think you said sort of at the onset around the options, one of which was lowering our standards or lowering our goals. I would just say from my seat, that is like a non-negotiable, not on the table to lower anything. I think to the point of criticality, I think for any of us that have know what it's like to struggle or know folks that it's like to struggle and know the reality of those, I will collectively summons ourselves to our best selves, including us as a state agency, that lowering our standards should not be highest and best use for us. So that's thing two. Couple of just additional things, and I'll wrap this up because I have learned similar things from many of our local governments around the state. You've imposed all of these things. All of this paper shuffling requirements of things, and of which none of it has come with any money, or we are woefully undersourced. And I'm particularly thinking about the prism of our small towns and rural communities that just by nature have less taxpayers or are generating less revenue. I would also just be curious to know within that surge, one, how much of those resources go to capacity for local governments, knowing how many local governments are doing development now and who aren't. So when I think about the capacity of those resources, not only just the development thereof, but the underwriting, the regulation, the long-term compliance of those units. So thinking beyond sort of the first few years, but the then what? So it's an asset to community. So thinking about where can the state and its girth and size help be a little bit more hands off to allow for more flexibility and observe some of the burdensome stuff that is also inevitable for it to be a long-term asset as well. So thinking about that. And then the other curiosity, and then I'll yield after this, is wanting to be mindful about out of all of well intent, not plopping local governments with resources and then saying we need outcomes right away in the next year or the next 2 years. Thinking about ample time to build up those infrastructure adequately, and what does like small, medium term look like? And I would just say, I think there is absolutely, I think it has to be the moment in front of us to figure out where we can, particularly as a state agency, as a government agency, figure out where we can be more hands-off with things and allow for more real flexibility, not flexibility as defined by a state agency.
Those are all really good points. I agree with them. The couple that I want to highlight on, yes, I think there does have to be some capacity component to this because you're right. It's not just pouring concrete. There is some capacity that local governments need to have to run this stuff. I would expect as part of a legislative package, there'd be a percentage that's allowed for that. And then as far as plopping them with money and then start saying, where's our results? I think you pair this with other recommendations that we've adopted, if it's our SDC programs or something else, so that it's rolled out in a logical and methodical way. So, but those are all really good points. And this is, yeah, I agree. Other questions? Time check with leadership. Do we want to plow ahead or do we want to hold the first readings over?
Well, I see JD's hand went up.
JD has a thought, yeah.
Let's touch base, yeah.
Yeah, real quickly, I was just about to do a time check. We got 2 minutes left, and in the interest of seeing the rest of these approved, I would make a motion to add 10 minutes to our agenda.
All right, we got a motion for 10 additional minutes.
Second that.
Got a second, all right. Can I just get a really informal, everybody say aye if you support it?
Aye.
Speak now if you are in opposition. Okay, we got 10 more minutes.
All right, I'm on the clock. We'll move a little quicker. Okay,
Let's
this next
go.
one is
You're up.
Catalyzing Portland. This comes from our colleague Tom, who's not here right now, but he raised a very excellent point that, you know, a lot of this battle will be won or lost within Portland. And so there are some specific things that we know will create additional housing in Portland. Having said that, I will draw attention to the fact that the committee thinks these are actually good statewide, but in the interest of getting things immediately done, this is low-hanging fruit that can see some results very quickly. I want to draw your attention to the highlighted item number 6 at the bottom of suspending inclusionary housing. That was omitted due to a typographical error from the top box on the printed reports, but it is within the body of it. Tom, I see you're back. Do you want to speak in 30 seconds or less to why you think this is an appropriate state level action?
This one speaks for itself. Given our lofty housing production goals, we live or die essentially by what does or doesn't happen in Portland. Huge kudos to the city because they're out ahead on a lot of this stuff. They've already studied the inclusionary housing ordinance and its impact on permitting activity. That particular study indicates levers that can be pulled to accelerate housing production, including the suspension of or the expansion of things like the multi-unit property tax exemption program and systems development charge waivers, which are currently limited to 60% and below housing. So a lot of the body of this recommendation deals with expanding those programs up to 120. So to be applicable to workforce housing, essentially middle income housing as well. So look forward to any questions on it.
I will note that Tom actually ran this through multiple work groups, and finance was just the last one. So that's why we got to carry it. But land development, codes and design have also seen this. And as I understand it, didn't object. So any questions? Okay. Moving on, the creation of a housing finance authority. This results from a lot of testimony we've received about the efficiency of how we currently push out dollars and the thought that there is a better way to do it. Lots of states have a semi-independent agency that solely focuses on pushing out government dollars for real property that's related to housing. And Finance Committee recommends that. And the argument in chief is that there's a lot on OHCS's plate, like a lot. I mean, they've just had stuff piled on them in the last few years, and having a dedicated space of people who are finance experts and transaction experts will allow money to get out the door quicker and more efficiently. We have some additional companion recommendations that are in the pipeline related to transaction, like with the Department of Justice or with the AG's office, being able to provide dedicated personnel or outside counsel. But we think this is kind of a threshold matter for general efficiency improvements. Margaret was the lead sponsor on this. Margaret, do you have anything that you want to add briefly?
Read the recommendation.
An excellent comment. Questions? Moving on. Consolidated tax reform. All right.
So hand up over here.
Whoa, yeah, you're just gonna stop me if you can't see me. All right, go ahead.
Yep, a couple things. I will try my best to keep it brief, and then we can. I will preface this with, it would be. I will extend ourselves, myself included, to have a more in earnest follow-up conversation about this, which I think didn't happen and absolutely is needed. So, a couple brief comments here. So one, we absolutely embrace the need to assess any and all real options that can help produce affordable housing. And I think it's important, as I mentioned earlier, for all of us, state government agencies included, to not continue to just move forward because it's familiar and it's what we've done. So just preface comments with that. A couple things here I would just want us to be able to look at, particularly as we go into second and potentially third reading on this. So there are absolutely a few housing finance agencies across the nation that operate in different spaces. So while we are centering and serving the people of Oregon, it would be really great for us to do an in earnest exercise with some of those HFAs, so Florida, California, some maybe not even on the West Coast, to really have a solid understanding, and that we're pulling from current day information and not maybe anything in the past. We want to make sure that we're saying is as relevant and accurate information, and whatever we can do to help generate that and just have an open dialogue, I think would be really helpful. The other piece, which I think is kind of an interesting one, that I'd be curious to see if there's what information we can glean from this, but as the agency has grown and expanded, both in terms of financial footprint and then diversity of the work, one of the things we've never actually had a dialogue or explored before is, what does it mean for if an agency is a currently existing executive branch agency, that frame essentially dictates sort of the types of positions you can get, the compensation thereof, all of those things. So those don't feel like the most exciting thing, but when you have dramatically shifted from, the 90s to 2023, and your sort of organizing statutes haven't changed, then you find this very real rub with being able to, I think, bring the necessary sort of talent and recruitment in. And so I think that's an important piece. I would say the other thing is, I would maybe challenge the assumption a bit, and I think with facts and information as well, about sort of the financing experts sort of that are in-house. I think just to make sure that we all kind of have collective visibility around sort of the financing expertise that is in-house, both on, we're talking here about affordable housing and middle income production, but some of the other kind of opportunities to consider on the lending side on how we can better leverage some of those resources so that we're not operating in a financial vacuum on that piece. So whatever we can do to help make sure that we're bringing insights into that. And then I would say the last piece is just also thinking about market shifts, particularly as we've all had to contend with market shifts, is the importance of just considerations of direct lending. So whether we're talking about like a multifamily accelerated processing, so a MAP partnership, like through a joint venture with FHA MAP lenders. So thinking about some of those considerations as well as we move on to the next piece. So whatever we can do to help facilitate some of those kind of broader and more kind of detailed conversations to explore the recommendation and where it goes, happy to do that.
One thing that I think is really important to highlight from what Director Bell just said is when you are a state agency, you are really constrained on what you can pay people, what your positions are, how you get positions authorized, and who you can hire as consultants and how you hire them to assist with transactions. All of that we arrived at saying, let's make it semi-independent because it's one action you can do to get out of all of that. It is totally possible to amend the enabling statute and amend the other processes. It just sounded like a nightmare to us. But stepping back from how you actually get it done, the important thing is that we equip the right people with the right pay and the right tools and the right resources to get the money out the door. That's what drove all of this. So Margaret, and then I saw Deb, I thought. So
I just want to acknowledge this requires a lot of study and a lot of engagement. And so the recommendation does, just to assure Andrea, the recommendation absolutely does suggest that a study be conducted to test the business theory, to do some stakeholder engagement. We did take a run at this some 10 years ago. So it's not a completely new conversation, but so in some ways resurrecting some of the questions that were asked about 10 years ago. So this is a complicated one that you're not going to do overnight, and the recommendation is to go study it.
Deb, did you have something?
I was just going to say that if it could be part of HAPO, maybe. And so that would just be a question.
Possibly.
Anybody else? Marching along. Okay.
2 minutes.
Oh, it's totally going to work. Consolidated tax reform. All right. This is the other part of, hey, we could raise statewide revenue and just support infrastructure. There's also some how we raise revenue things that would change how cities long-term get their revenue and also the incentives that people have. So I'm going to run through them quickly. They're all incredibly detailed. You need to read the whole memo. The first one, let's go big or go home, Measure 50 reform. Measure 50 came in the mid-90s and said you can't take your assessed value up more than 3% a year. Since then, if you look at the ratio of assessed values to real market values, we're somewhere in the 50 to 55% range statewide, which basically says our tax burden to support local government as a share of our assets has fallen pretty consistently over 20 years, and it is breaking city financing. This is not a new news to anybody who's involved in government finance. So this would say change the increase in MAVs every year from 3% to 5% so that we could slowly trend back up, especially after we've had a big round of inflation, telling cities you get 3% more money, but your costs went up 8%. That gets pulled out of capital projects so that they can support staff. They cut back cops, things like that. We need to have a conversation about that. Other options for Measure 50 are authorizing voters to increase their permanent levy. Permanent levies were set based on how things were in the 90s, and situations have changed. This is most obvious when you look at rural timber counties that just don't have a levy that supports they can't even provide sheriff's deputies, let alone the capital that's required to support additional housing. Additionally, there's some work that being done around exempting cities and counties from compression. Compression is what happens when you have more taxes than the Constitution allows, getting money to flow first to general government and then to special districts and other levies. Other consolidated tax things that we could do. If you think Measure 50 is a lot, how about we rewrite the entire tax code at the local level and adopt a land value tax? Land value tax is awesome if you like economics. Basically, what it says is we tax you based on the value of your land, not the improvements that are upon it. And there's a couple reasons behind that. The big reason is taxes, when you tax something, you discourage it. That's why we like sin taxes. Hey, let's tax cigarettes. We'll raise money and we'll discourage people from smoking. The way that our property tax system works right now is we say, you've got a piece of land. If you build an apartment on it, we're going to tax you more. And that's actually the opposite of what we want to do. We want to encourage people to develop, especially within the urban growth boundary. So a land value tax says we will tax you based on your land. If you improve your land, if you want to take your money and build things on it, we're not going to penalize you as a government. It's also economically fair because the value of land is generally driven by public improvements that have been made. An acre on a freeway, on an I-5 interchange in Portland is worth a lot more than an acre in the middle of nowhere. And that is because the public has paid for improvements, therefore it's appropriate for the public to recapture value based on the land value. It's not appropriate for the public to recapture value based on private investment coming in. This also encourages the efficient use of land, especially within the urban area. So it is consistent with our land use philosophy of developing within it UGBs, and it will encourage more dense development. Could talk on this for hours, but I'll keep moving along. Eliminating the mortgage interest deduction for second homes, not a huge cash source, as you can see, but it is consistent with encouraging housing development. If you have a home, we want to encourage home ownership. If you have a second home, does the government really need to be subsidizing your interest on that? Probably not, at least while we're in a housing emergency. Property tax exemption for new housing at 120 AMI or below. We have property tax exemptions for 60 and below in a lot of the state, but really being at 120% AMI, I encourage you all to look at what 120 is. You're not rolling in cash. And if we have got around conceptually that we need to subsidize through property tax 60% and below, we can look at raising that up, maybe on a graduated basis, but there is room for expanding that up to 120% AMI. Finally, we have lots of tax exemptions. These are tax expenditures, which we would all call tax exemptions. On the property tax side, it's over 100 of them. A lot of them aren't related to housing, and we would encourage the legislature to look at those to say, are there some of those that we can sunset out? Again, local jurisdictions are starved for revenue and are not able to comply with the demands we are put on them. This is a logical way to get more revenue to local jurisdictions. Having said that, I will stop, and I will absolutely expect there will be more questions at reading 2 and reading 3. Are there any questions here that people just have to ask? The last couple I can do super quick because they're the simplest, so I'm just going to keep going because no one's objected. Modular housing incentive program. Here's a 20 grand to a manufacturer if you make modular housing. Super simple. It helps the industry start up, and it's contingent upon a certificate of occupancy being issued for that modular house being placed within Oregon. So it's got to stay here, and it helps get the industry off the ground. And there's a beauty and simplicity of just saying we will subsidize you at a per dollar basis. Well, I will note that this is much, much less than the subsidies we give out for things like LIST on a per unit basis. So if this incentivizes more housing, we're getting a lot of bang for our buck. It also jumpstarted an industry that is pretty universally accepted to be needed. We have the housing cash bounty, which is the even simpler version of this. We know that cities are strained right now, and one of the chief complaints is, you want us to build more housing, we can't service what we got right now. We will give every city $10,000 for every unit that they add for the duration of the emergency. They can use it however they want. It's unrestricted revenue. You need to hire cops, go hire cops. You need to upgrade stormwater, go upgrade stormwater. Cities bear the brunt of more housing. we got to pitch in here and give them some incentive to go with it. This is limited to the annexed city limits, so there should be no discussion about urban sprawl or creep, anything like that. If you're in a city and you're building housing, the state's behind you, and we're going to send you the cash to put our money where our mouth is. And finally, we have a low interest loan fund, which is creating a new revolving loan fund at below market interest rate to support up to 120% AMI development. Everybody knows interest rates are through the roof. If you want to draw a direct line to housing production, making subsidized financing available is the way to do it. This is also an acknowledgement of the fact that we have lots of resources at 60% AMI and below, but between 60 and 120, there's still a tremendous amount of need, and it's a critical path item for the governor's order to be successful. So making subsidized financing available there. I will stop now. I hope that meets the bare minimum legal requirements for first reading. I know that we'll have lots of good discussion in the weeks to come. And I yield back my negative balance of time.
Yes, thank you. A lot of good content there. You know, members of the council, feel free to reach out either through the co-chairs or directly to Finance Committee. If there are questions, follow up on all of that. As you know, these will be coming back to us in the space 2 more times. So everything, let's talk about it. Let's optimize a whole lot there. Thank you also to the council for being willing to stay a little bit longer. As we get towards the end of this, there might be a couple more you know, needs to meet beyond the kind of scheduled times. And so I really appreciate your flexibility on that, and all the great work that you're doing that's giving us these conversations to have. So unless there's anything else for the good of the order, Matt, do we have next steps that we want to talk about real quick?
Real quick, next steps are, we have a meeting next Friday. It just, because of the way holidays will be falling in November, we'll be meeting next Friday, and then 2 weeks after that. The draft agenda will be in your inbox in a few minutes. And for members of the public, the agenda and the materials are being posted to the website at the moment. There's a number of new first readings, and we'll be rolling things into second and third readings as well.
Fantastic. And here I was thinking we wouldn't get through all those first readings. Thank you, folks, for the great work. And see you next week, everybody. Enjoy yourselves. Meeting adjourned. Take care.